Welcome to Elmhurst University Intercultural Lecture Series. My name is Mladen Turk, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Honors Program and Professor of Religious Studies. During the webinar, please use the Q&A feature to make comments and ask questions. And at the end, I will address your questions to our speaker. The goal of these lectures is understanding, appreciating, and celebrating cultural differences as critical to the well-being of individuals and communities. As a key component of the university's mission and core values, intercultural education helps to prepare students and faculty for meaningful and ethical work in a multicultural global society. The Honors Program organizes 4 annual intercultural lectures in a visiting scholar for a day format. Cesar Chavez Lecture, established in 1996, this lecture is held each fall to coincide with Hispanic Heritage Month and is part of the university's Hispanic Heritage Celebration. The William R. Johnson Intercultural Lecture, the newest of the university's intercultural lectures, formally named in 2011, is held each fall to coincide with National Coming Out Day and is part of the university's commitment to the history, issues, and life stories of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community. Martin Luther King Jr. Lecture, this lecture, is established in 1993 and is held each winter to coincide with Black History Month and is part of the university's annual celebration of Black heritage. Genevieve Stout Intercultural Lecture, established in 2002, is held each spring to coincide with Women's History Month and is part of the university's Women's History Celebration. Our next Stout lecture is on Wednesday, March 10 at 4 p.m., the same time, same day. And we are hosting Dr. Linda Thomas to give a talk titled In Pursuit of Justice, Womanist Non-Binary Perspectives about Intersectionality. And I hope to see many of you at that time too. At this time, it is my honor and privilege to introduce the president of Elmhurst University, Dr. Troy Waneke. Troy?
Thank you, Mladen, and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. The Martin Luther King Jr. Lecture has always been an important lecture for the university. We must never forget that Dr. King spoke on campus in 1966 in Hammersmith Memorial Chapel. In fact, if you look at my virtual background, I changed it at my wife's bequest. This is the chapel, and it's in honor of that speech from almost 55 years ago today. I'm proud that we can all share in that legacy and that we're finding new ways to give it life today. For example, on Monday, we announced the winners of our American Dream Fellowship Competition, a scholarship contest that celebrates and supports first-generation college students by giving them the opportunity to go to college and transform their lives. I'd like to thank the Office of Diversity and Inclusion and our intercultural student organizations for their ongoing work here on campus, especially this month, for all the activities that they've planned to celebrate Black History Month. The Martin Luther King Jr. Intercultural Lecture was established in 1993. It's held each winter to coincide with Black History Month and is part of the university's annual celebration of Black heritage. I hope you'll find today's lecture meaningful. My thanks to Dr. Mladen Turk for bringing us today's presentation. And now it's my honor to introduce Raven Roan, an active scholar athlete on campus. Raven is the current president of our Black Student Union, a member of our women's basketball team, and hails from the state of Texas, where her friends and family are experiencing some Chicagoland weather the last few days. Thank you, and I'll now turn it over to Raven.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Raven Roan. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the president of Black Student Union. I'd like to thank Dr. Turk for allowing me to participate in this evening's event. As well, I would like to thank our speaker, Ms. Williams, for lending her valuable time and knowledge to us. I just want to briefly talk about BSU and how we are navigating through Black History Month. So our mission as the Black Student Union is to inform, encourage, and strengthen the unity of Black or African American and persons of color students on campus. as well as create an engaging and informative space for allies. As BSU, we want to make a welcoming, engaging, relatable, and informative environment for those seeking to learn how to accept and respect those despite race, religion, gender, creed, or sexual orientation. Black History Month is a time where all Americans are encouraged to remember and celebrate the courage, contributions, and accomplishments of Blacks to this country. Likewise, understanding the traditions of the Black men and women that came before us. It means honoring and reflecting on the challenges we as Black people have overcome and are continuing to overcome. Black History Month is about integrity, dignity, and determination of Black Americans, a sign of hope from struggle and the representation of undeniable true character. Black History Month serves to acknowledge the accomplishments and legacy of Black people on American history and prosperity, as every month is Black History Month. That being said, we as BSU have had some really good meetings these past 2 weeks, and we have some really good events planned for the rest of the month. The past 2 events we've had have focused kind of around informing students on proper interviewing strategies to get a job. And we've had the opportunity to even have a professional photographer come in to have headshots done for their resumes. Likewise, we had just this past Monday, we had a meeting where we talked about understanding the difference between culture appropriation and culture appreciation, and how to navigate a conversation with someone and to educate rather than to prosecute. This week on Friday, we are going to have our BSU annual fashion show called Prada My Style. And we have students from campus who come to be models, and we'll have trivia that's based around Black influence. And then next week, following that, starting that Monday, we will be having a lot of events going on. It's called our Blackout Week. And during this week, we have a few very important events that I just like to highlight. So we have an N-word panel, which will be addressing the effects of the N-word throughout history and in our day-to-day life. We'll also have an event called Suit and Tie, where we'll have Black entrepreneurs coming to talk about their businesses and their goals and share their experience in their field. And one that I think is really important right now is our event on the 25th called Let's Policy, where we're informing students on executive, judicial, and legislative laws and rights. And we're planning to have local politicians and possibly even national politicians come in to speak to the students on campus. And that's basically it for us this month. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Raven. At this time, I would like to introduce Dr. Karen Benjamin, Professor of History here at Elmhurst University. Dr. Benjamin is an expert on 20th century US history, and her research and publications are on history of segregation in schools and housing. And Dr. Benjamin will introduce our speaker. Karen?
Good afternoon. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce Ms. Sherry Williams, who was born and raised on the south side of Chicago in the Englewood community, and who is the founder and president of the Bronzeville Black Chicagoan Historical Society. As such, she served as a board member of the Chicago Cultural Alliance, was voted the first African-American vice president of the Pullman Civic Organization, and secured space to provide African-American cultural programs on the Stephen A. Douglas tomb site and Monument Park grounds. Her programming has resulted in partnerships with the University of Chicago, the City of Chicago, and the Field Museum. She accomplished all this while earning a BA in Inner City Studies at Northeastern Illinois University and a master's in Library and Information Science at UIUC. In 2012, Ms. Williams developed an African heritage garden and migratory bird oasis at the tomb site to reflect the migration of Black Southerners to Chicago and to increase the park space open to local residents, thus bringing life to Monument Park. In honor of her work, she received a Together Green Fellowship from Toyota and the National Audubon Society, among many other awards. Bronzeville Historical Society's presence at Monument Park also reminded visitors that enslaved workers provided the basis for Senator Douglas's wealth. In fact, it was Miss Williams' research that first highlighted Douglas's role as an enslaver, one with a particularly brutal reputation. Historian Guy Emerson Mount and renowned journalist Ta-Nehisi Coates, who were working together on a project to uncover the University of Chicago's roots in slavery, soon learned that Miss Williams was already light years ahead of them. She was the first to locate the descendants of those who were enslaved by Senator Douglas, and she had been honoring their ancestors at the tomb site for years. Dr. Mount and Ta-Nehisi Coates attended one of her libation ceremonies to honor those whose labor had laid the foundation for the creation of the University of Chicago. For the last 8 years, I have had the pleasure to work with Miss Williams on the course Forming the Chicago Ghetto. Miss Williams trained our students to conduct oral history interviews that were uploaded to the Bronzeville Historical Society's website, to use geocaching to create a database of the grave sites in Chicago's segregated Black cemeteries, and to help organize and preserve the Bronzeville Historical Society's archival collections. Her insight, wit, and persistence are my inspiration. Her resourcefulness, too. She can do more with nothing than most would believe possible. One of the many skills she acquired as a descendant of enslaved Civil War soldiers from the Delta. I can tell you that there is no fire that she would not walk through for a righteous cause. Please give a very warm welcome to my mentor, Miss Sherry Williams.
What a tribute. I am so honored. Thank you, my dear sister, Karen Benjamin. I am truly honored to be introduced by you, my friend, my confidant, and my colleague. Peace and blessings to everyone at Elmhurst University, students, alumni, faculty, staff. A special thank you to President Troy Van Aken, to Mladen Turk, and Raven Rowe for your remarks prior to this introduction. I'm just at awe to have such a wonderful welcome. Good afternoon to all in the Zoom audience, friends, family, and communities across the nation. I greatly appreciate your participation in the Elmhurst University annual Martin Luther King Jr. Intercultural Lecture, my presentation, Painful Past or Present Politics, an examination of my own life in racially polarized Chicago. In these times, I can't help but think that it's impossible for me to acknowledge that folks just don't know what's really going on. I just can't see that happening. The idea that we, as US citizens, could find an escape to hearing, seeing the present day protests, global warnings about global warming, COVID death tolls, the impeachment trial, the growing number of January 6th Capitol siege arrests. It's just impossible for me to believe that we're not paying attention, that there are people out there that don't know what's going on. I think that just doesn't exist. Our smartphones, our devices, and the internet provides 24 hours news from all over the world. If anyone is looking for an escape hatch, I believe it's safe to say there is none. We are here, no matter the discomfort. We are here at yet another intersection in American society where we can determine the fate of our families, our communities, and our nation. And we must choose wisely. I am a 61-year-old woman of African descent, born and raised in the Inglewood community. My family were all migrants from Mississippi. I was born at 1023 West 59th Street, following my elder brothers, Marlon and Stephen. We lived on the second floor in an apartment building with stores on the street level of a busy intersection of CTA buses, freight trucks, and 24-hour traffic. I weaved in and out of neighbors' homes on a daily basis, and also at least 5 storefront churches. The elders shaped my understanding of politeness, respect, and love of my Blackness. Tragically, on April 4th, 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. I would like to now take a pause for a moment of silence to honor his life and his legacy, and to reflect on the nearly 500,000 people who have died due to the COVID pandemic in the United States. Thank you for permitting that opportunity. When Dr. King was murdered, I was just 8 years old, and the emotional wave of learning what death was more than what I really could understand, but somehow the how and the why began to unfold through television and muffled conversations between the adults. Mixed responses included, he should have taken civil rights at a slower pace. Where were the police? He should have been protected. Many in my own family were already anticipating the aftermath, and it did come swiftly. Riots broke out across the many major American cities. Violence, arson, and deep tensions were in the air. The elementary school that I attended dismissed students early on Friday, April 5th, 1968. And I walked home alone, this 8-year-old, and I met an eerie silence on what was usually a very busy street. There were no CTA buses, no vehicles, no freight trucks, nothing. The street was abandoned. And I pushed open the door to the entry just to meet my mother face to face, toting a shotgun. Where are your brothers? I could barely answer. She looked both ways down the street, hoping they could be seen. The Black Panther Party had an office just 2 doors east of our entrance, and the men in the black berets stood there and just nodded at her. We went upstairs. At age 8, I learned Blackness could get you killed. Dr. King's death disrupted more than the regularly scheduled programs. His life and death are a course way beyond this presentation. To understand the hardships Blacks faced during the 1960s, we must examine policies, laws, Jim Crow segregation, and white supremacy. Federal laws enacted were particularly hard on poor Black Americans. For example, in 1961, as part of the inclusion of unemployed parents in the Aid to Families with Dependent Children, AFDC, federal guidelines now required states to deny assistance to families if the unemployed parent refused to accept work without good cause. This ambiguous clause began stripping Black families by stripping the fathers away. Many had no choice because they could not earn enough money to keep the family sustained without federal aid. So when the Trump administration family separation policy was adopted in April 2018, I was reminded of the separated children and infants from their fathers due to AFDC rules. The care and the welfare of children should be our priority. Children should not be placed in cages nor live in poverty. Leadership should not have to be convinced or shamed to hear the voices of the disenfranchised, the oppressed, the poor, or those seeking asylum. Are we willing and able to move on? Or do we walk back to 1968? Have we really faced the deeply embedded racism and disinvestment in Black communities? Do understand that nothing has been easy for me with this Black skin. I have inherited the very issues that King lost his life for. I am reminded by microaggressions and just outright racist remarks how hated we are. The only time I'm not assaulted is when I stay in the house. Okay, I take that back because I'm further traumatized by events that unfold when I watch television. Disdain, rudeness, ignoring my presence is a few of the ways that prejudice is shelved upon me. Daily, if I'm at colleges or universities, in libraries or city hall, and especially in the arena of library science, museums, and white cultural settings. January 29th, 1966, Dr. Martin Luther King and his wife, Coretta Scott King, moved into the 1550 South Hamlin Street apartment. The Chicago Freedom Movement was officially launched. There had been a number of racial conflicts in 1964 and 1965 at the corner of the block that I lived. Dozens of injuries and arrests of Black residents are chronicled in newspapers. The 58th and Morgan Street Viaduct was the understood racial line, and Blacks moving further and further north on Morgan Street was a challenge. Whites were trying desperately to hold on that marker, keep us in place, keep us not moving further than the north side of 57th and Morgan. My godfather, Reverend Jamie Canty, often recalls how his godmother, Rosa Parks, would visit the family home on 59th and Morgan. She was best friends with his mother and her husband, Raymond Parks. He owned a barbershop in Alabama where his father was a business partner. The activism is deeply rooted in the Inglewood community, very deeply rooted. As you can see on your screen, I just wanted to give a shout out to those who have paved the way. This image is of Reverend Canty at one of many peace circles that take place in the Inglewood community. When I arrived in Chicago in 1966, when King arrived in Chicago in 1966, it was already a hostile and racially segregated city. Boycotts, protests, and sit-ins were taking place in Inglewood. In 1965, the first 100 Black students were enrolled in Gage Park High School to ease overcrowding in Inglewood High School and other Chicago Black high schools. Their arrival marked the beginning of more than 8 years of abusive tactics by white students and white parents and the school board itself to deter enrollment. In September 1972, more than 1,000 white students and their parents boycotted Gage Park High School for 32 days. Additionally, they had patrols to monitor the movement of pretty much everyone that was coming in and around the Inglewood community. And often these patrols were set for violence. In 1971, my family had moved from 59th and Morgan to 6012 South Marshfield. Yes, still Inglewood. The understood racial boundary was Racine, which is 1200 West. It got moved as far west as Damon, which is 2000 West, just 8 blocks, just a mile. And when we made that move from 59th and Morgan to 60th and Marshfield, we were the 4th Black family to move on that block. It seemed like overnight that white families moved out. Integration of Gage Park High School had begun in 1965, but continuously, Black children and families were the target of racism. Every day, the police were at the high schools, but they never intervened when white teens used gangs, fists, fights, and struggles to remind my brother Marlon and my cousin Anthony that they were not welcome. My mother, my grandmother, and aunts all lived within a few blocks of each other. All had moved in 1971 to West Inglewood. Racial violence was very familiar to them. They had moved to Chicago from Inverness, Mississippi in 1942. Inverness, Mississippi is the birthplace of the White Citizens Council. They make the Proud Boys look like Boy Scouts. These domestic terrorists control the banks, the plantations, the post office, and all commerce. Additionally, my grandmother had to pretend that a relative was sick and family in Chicago in order to just leave Inverness, Mississippi. So the migration was plagued with many challenges and in many ways that kept them locked in poverty in Mississippi. So she had to pretend there was an ill family member in order to take the Illinois Central Train Railroad just to leave Mississippi. And in Chicago, they were moved again by eminent domain from 31st and Wentworth in order to make room for the Dan Ryan Expressway in 1954. Well, here we are now in 2021, 50 years plus later, and I speak to you on Black History Month, and I ask that you imagine with me a United States. Has COVID amplified these racial tensions and economic disparities and racism that exist? Have we had enough? I'm stopping here at the year 1972 because all of this is quite enough to consider. A call to legislators is not enough. a mass movement for justice, pay equity, health care for all, deliberate investment in impoverished communities is a start. But if any of you feel compelled to make a difference, it all begins with a single act of kindness. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherry. I'm looking at our Q&A feature here, and I do not see any open questions, so I would ask our audience at this time to please submit your questions, thoughts, comments in the Q&A feature of the Zoom webinar. Karen, do you have any response, anything to add?
I do. While we're waiting for questions, I noticed that you have the Aunt Jemima box behind you, and I'm not sure if anyone who is attending today saw you on the news, ABC 7 last week, interviewed about that change, and I was wondering if you could speak to that for just a minute.
Well, we were blessed with Dr. Karen participated in us having a Zoom so that those who wanted to see a burial marker placed at Mrs. Nancy Green's gravesite here in Chicago at Oakwood Cemetery. We had a ceremony on September 5th, 2020, and the ceremony through Zoom allowed for Nancy Green's family members and those who just really wanted to see her get this tribute participate virtually. And so when Mrs. Nancy Green lived here in Chicago, she was the spokesperson for the Aunt Jemima brand product. Her first appearances were at the 1893 Chicago World Fair. And at that fair, she sold over 50,000 boxes of Aunt Jemima product mix. And so, of course, I was a little alarmed by the removal of her image from the packaging and the branding, and mostly because I knew that this one way that a Black face was a part of, say, the kitchen tables of all ethnicities from all walks of life, people knew this brand based off of this Black woman's imagery. And so I thought it was an insult that the package had the image removed and also changed its name without recognizing the phenomenal women who had represented the product brand and had made the product brand a success. I mean, in the billions. And so PepsiCo had put out an alert, an announcement that they would invest $400 million into historical Black colleges and universities, institutions where African-American history is being taught, organizations that have a platform about elevating the stories of Black life in America. And I am yet to see that come to fruition. Letters had been sent out to PepsiCo, not only from myself, but from other colleagues who manage and operate historical organizations. And none of us have received any response at all. And this is well over a year. So I will continue to recognize Mrs. Nancy Green, who is the original, the first woman to portray the Aunt Jemima brand. As long as I've got breath in my body, I will continue to give her a salute. She is noted as one of the missionaries for Olivet Baptist Church on the South Side in Bronzeville at 31st and King Drive. That congregation is noted as being the oldest Black Baptist congregation in the city. Their beginnings are in the 1840s. So we're talking about free men and women of African descent who established this congregation so many years ago. So those are things that a lot of people may not know and associate with the branding, that there were real women whom had portrayed and supported and expanded how the product was sold.
Thank you so much. There's one question that might be for Karen, actually. Julie asks about the oral history projects and training, and if you can say a little bit more about that, I guess either of you. Maybe that's for Karen, maybe for Sherry.
For the oral history projects, I would say that when I started this journey, my daughters nudged me to really look at incorporating the Bronzeville Black Chicagoan Historical Society, because they grew tired of me giving them stories. So we lived on 45th near King Drive, and we would drive to my mom's house on 32nd and King Drive. And I did the same thing my mom and my grandmother did. I would always point out historical buildings and talk about the phenomenal histories associated with these properties. I would point out Metropolitan Church. Oh, that's where the Pullman Porters had their first meetings at. Oh, that's where Ida B. Wells' house is at. That's where Lou Palmer's house is at. And so they grew so tired of me giving these stories, just driving. They said, "Ma, start a historical society." So in 1999, that's what we did. We incorporated, and never did I imagine, you know, that society, this society would move on to doing oral history recordings. I never imagined the society would move on to documenting African-American burials in Lincoln Cemetery and Burr Oak Cemetery. And these, again, are segregated cemeteries because Jim Crow existed in Chicago and surrounding communities as well. So all of this came as just really God's grace, his opening up an opportunity for me to speak on behalf of the ancestors and speak on behalf of those elders who I'm around all the time. And so close to 17 years, I had been videotaping families and having interviews, never imagining that they would be a part of a larger community of scholars, having access to them. And slowly we're opening up our images and photographs to the public as well through Chicago Collections Consortium and the work of the Chicago Cultural Alliance, and certainly the grit and energy that has been poured in through amazing volunteers and staff. My daughters Joy and Asia and Shayna certainly deserve the shared accolades for being the founding members. So much of it is on websites. We have 3 YouTube stations, and some hold the interviews that were organized by Dr. Karen Benjamin to record the stories of individuals who lived in Chicago public housing. So there's interviews from residents of Madden Park homes, from Ida B. Wells, from Robert Taylor Public Housing, from every single public housing structure that was part of this design for racial separation in Chicago along the Stateway Corridor. Those interviews were taken through the energy and the brilliance of Dr. Karen saying, "Hey, I can get this done, Sherry, let's do it."
Thank you.
I'll have my daughter post for the YouTube stations as well on the chat box.
Thank you so much. There is one more question here that might be related. Amy asks about your work on how to make green spaces, nature, safer and more accessible for people of color in the Chicago area.
So I do things very radical, and I certainly don't want people to get in trouble, but I will tell you that it's been successful by being radical sometimes. So I always watched my elders and how they operated. And so what they did, they occupied. They didn't ask permission for how do you say have access to a vacant lot or use assets that are in or around communities. So this is how the bird oasis at the Pullman State Historic Site at 111th and Cottage Grove, and the Douglas Tomb Bird Oasis at 600 East 35th Street, those sites came as a result of occupying. So I didn't ask for permission from anyone. I just thought that this was a great space that the communities adjacent to it could be using, it could be beneficial. And then I also observed that they were already organically being used in some way. And this is particularly important when we look at the Stephen A. Douglas tomb site, you know, this enslaver who had 120 plus slaves, but was senator in Illinois. That's another story. But I didn't ask for permission. I just started using the grounds in a way that I saw community was using it, and I would ask questions. And residents would tell me they had been coming there for generations. Black migrants have been in the Bronzeville community since the end of the Civil War. And so they were using Stephen Douglas tomb site, which had been there since 1861, as their, what we call an invisible church. So they would go there for meditation. They would go there to observe the wildlife. They would go there to look at the beauty of the plantings that were there. You know, 5 generations of Black men were the caretakers of that site. And so the site often would be open 24 hours because families would come there and have picnics. So imagine this is where a grave is at. They were using the monument in a way that beyond its intended use as being the resting place for Senator Douglas. And I just picked up on it and then began looking at what was done by the caretakers. The caretakers, all of African descent, had gardens there already that was to supplement their families' need for produce in their family. It was a home on the site for the caretaker. And so when he retired, that was the site that was already cleared. So we began with that site by putting in an African Heritage Garden. And then later we expanded and then got permission to put in the plantings that would attract birds and butterflies, to talk about the parallels of African American migration from the South and the migration of birds. So these things happen organically. They didn't come out of, because I can't do meetings. I'm so sorry. I can't do 50 committees and let's figure it out. If a person says they've got a rake and another person says they've got a lawnmower and someone has some shovels and someone has seeds, I believe occupying spaces that are underutilized, whether it's a vacant lot, whether it's in a auntie's backyard and she don't mind folks coming in and planting some edibles so that the public can come and have exchange, conversation, network, all the things that happen out of gardening. I think anyone that's listening can produce this same positive result by looking at space and just making it happen. Now, I do know that some of us are wealthy enough that we have vacant lots or we have properties that we're not using, whether it's in the city, whether it's in the suburbs. You know, why not look at these spaces in a different way and open up an opportunity for someone to plant things intentionally to attract birds, or plant things intentionally that could feed a family. And I think that's the way it should be done.
Thank you. There are many expressions of thanks for what you already said. There is one question Josh, I think, asks about in your lifetime, in your experience, what changed regarding racial relations in the United States, or in your case, in your experience, and what stayed the same? So in your personal history regarding racial relations, what changed, what stayed the same?
Well, I would say what has stayed the same is that there's these slow processes for equity. And, you know, a lot of people think it's this law that it automatically happens. Okay, small example is when Brown versus the Board of Education, you know, some people may imagine that, oh, that opened up equity in how schools are funded or assets that need to happen inside of, say, books or computers or whatever is needed in school, that it's modeled, you know, school to school. But we can tell from even looking at Chicago that that's not the case. You know, you may have Walter Payton School with computers that students can take home and it's a high school, and you might have a high school like Wendell Phillips that the students don't have access to computers. So I think that that's the one thing that is really troubling for me, is that we need to wrap around understanding, despite these legislation, that it doesn't equate into it actually happening. And I mean, so much to the point that I have aunts, great aunts who were educators in Mississippi, and the minute Brown versus Board came across and was mandated, Mississippi legislators cut the funding for the Black teachers. So they essentially lost their jobs. And they were already getting half of the salary that white teachers were getting. So these things are way deeper than looking at legislation being solutions to or remedies for the things that are happening. There's equity that has to go beyond the law. And so following it through is some of the things that has been really problematic for me. Because even when I look at, you know, children are now it's at home, many of those families might have gotten a laptop for homeschooling or, you know, while they're sheltering in place, but they don't have internet. So how you get one thing and don't get the other, it's not good to have an assumption that if I give you the tools so that your child can be a part of classroom activities, the rest is left up to you. And we know that it's very expensive for internet. So that's just one example of what I see positive meaning in so far as legislation, but it did not equate into reality. The things that have improved, I would say that if I buy a first class ticket to get on a plane, I will get a first class seat. But that was not the case even as early as 1969. I remember, you know, we take a train to Mississippi, and the minute we get to Memphis, we've got to get on the Jim Crow car, which was nasty, filthy, probably had animals in it, you name it. But not so much now in public accommodations do you see where segregation is continuing. If I get a first class ticket for a plane, I'm pretty much guaranteed a first class seat, and that was not before.
Thank you. There's a group of questions that I think relates to what you just said. It is about education. So what kind of education, especially for this is from Anne, she asks about education of whites, basically. Do you think that this type of systemic racism then prevents people from overcoming it through education, or do you think that education can actually address this problem adequately?
I really think education can address it, and today's lecture is an example of that. But, you know, if we're thinking that Elmhurst is forward thinking, I mean, you guys have been in that position for 100 years plus. You know, that has been part of the platform for Elmhurst University is, you know, encouraging and making opportunities for public service or for volunteerism and things like that. But that might not be the platform for other schools, especially in higher education, that it's part of what the mission is. And so I do see education as one pathway for how we can learn more about what really is going on, have honest conversation and dialogue, you know, provide a platform for folks to speak their piece, whether you agree with it, whether you understand it, or whether you think it's nonsense. It's still a platform that I think is so needed. So this is why I really appreciate this opportunity. And I think that schools are being examined by the Biden administration so far as possibly pushing for community colleges to be free or economical, that more access will be available to those who maybe don't have the finances, or maybe are not in a position to get loans, or maybe want to take, one class at a time, which is what I did over a period of time before, moving on to graduate school. Couldn't afford to give that much, time to education while raising children. So I went a little bit, a class here and there. So I think that schools will have missions that include a public use of their spaces is real important, so that you don't have an auditorium that's just used only for events that are school sponsored, but you have your spaces open to the public for films that talk about some of these challenging times that we're at now. Or you have spaces where folks could come and maybe get clothing that students don't want. When I went to Western Illinois University, there was a nearby Salvation Army, and we have such a throwaway society. Countless items, hats, clothes, things that people leave on campus, we could easily give away a lot of things. I mean, I'm just thinking outside of the box of ways that don't require a whole lot of thinking, a whole lot of time. But I really think use of spaces in institutions such as Elmhurst by the public to have conversations and dialogue and action and activism, I think that's real important.
Thank you. Since you brought that up, yes, we are now going to celebrate our 150th anniversary. So it's 150 years since century and a half. So there's a group of questions that have to do with your thinking about how is Englewood doing now? How would you characterize the state of neighborhood, or maybe other comparable neighborhood? Where is it now?
Well, I can't speak entirely for the community of Englewood. I'm not a resident there. I would say that my doing some gardening there for the last 15 years, number of events that I've either participated in or been a co-collaborator to, because Englewood, of course, is my heart. That's where I was born. That's where I was raised. But I would say that just observing from the 1980s to now, the disinvestment is glaring. And so the number of new opportunities for housing or for education are quite limited. There is a wonderful Kennedy King College campus there that was recently rebuilt. I want to say it was 2012 or 13, but it's a fairly new campus that is there. But the dwindling number of people in the neighborhood is also due to many properties that were in distress that ended up being torn down. And then we must absolutely look at the huge number of local businesses that were overtaxed or overburdened that were removed. See, when I was a little girl, you could just go down the street and ask if a job was available at a local restaurant or shoe store or clothing store. And so now most of those shopping districts are gone, or they've diminished to the point that people who live in Englewood have to drive to a mall in order to get the things that they may want, or use online services. But these were things that were right there. There were 3 theaters in Englewood when I grew up, and all of them, had shows for families, and then of course they had adult movies as well, Wild Wild West movies and things like that. But I see promise in the community. And the reason why I see promise, because when I'm at gardens or if I go to events in Englewood, I hear the conversations from the residents talk about the things and the steps that they're doing in order to make certain that the next generation does not see the blight that is there now. So there is hope. How that would happen with the pandemic, of course, causing even more, further economic strains on not just Black communities that already were at strain, but globally we know that financially, economically, this has impacted us all. I know that often those with the least, those that are impacted the most, have in the past always been the last to get the help. And I'm truly hoping that this administration will take away some of the bureaucracy and have a straight line approach to uplifting communities that need it most. And I think the first thing that has to happen is the vaccines have to be available. I shouldn't have to call 15 numbers hoping that a roll of the dice will get me an appointment to have a vaccination when our communities are so severely impacted by this pandemic.
Thank you. And then I think this is going to be our last question. There are so many expressions of gratitude from our attendees here to you. We are going to save those, but there's a question from Arlette asks about what advice would you give to students, basically, these are undergraduate students now, to combat racism during their time as students, but also thinking about their preparation for their future career. So what advice would you give to our undergraduate students to combat racism?
The beauty of even taking that opportunity, pushing for that opportunity, applying for that opportunity to attend college is a major step. I mean, so you're in a position that countless people would love to be in. And because you're in that position, I believe the first thing that needs to happen is you have to shore up every single Black student club. You have to shore up every student club, and you have to shore up what are the needs of those students. And so when I was at Northeastern, one of the things I found out at that time, when I first returned to school, I was homeless. And when I found out I had need for, more food or ways to just navigate going to school and being homeless, and, how do you refrigerate your stuff when you're, going from house to house or car, wherever you're staying at, just to try to remain in classes. A lot of people don't realize there are a great number of folks in college who do not have a place to live. A lot of people in college that have very little to eat. A lot of people in college just need a bus pass. I lamented about the fact that if I did part-time, I couldn't get a bus pass. So you might even find out some of the smaller things that are needed just for our human dignity and for us being able to just have a balance while we continue our studies. So it could mean, setting up a small pantry where folks just come in and what's on the shelf, you grab it. It could mean setting up a closet where, I've got 5 coats and 2 of them I can fit, the other 3 I can't, where a closet is available for folks to grab a coat or boots or things like that. I think that some of the most intimate needs of a student are often not overlooked, but I would say that they're not on the forefront of how a student can successfully finish their coursework. So I think these clubs are a mirror of not just how many ways in which word gets out or how people are networking or how we're supporting each other. I think the clubs also can be the litmus test on what new thing or what thing that's going on that needs support or some uplift. They would know it, the students would know it. But some of the things I just spoke about, until I opened my mouth and shared with the administrators at Northeastern, why can't I get a bus pass? Oh, you're part-time. I said, that's ridiculous. because when I went to Western Illinois University, any bus I got on was free, regardless if I was part-time or half-time. So there are some policy things that need to be implemented. And there needs to be, you know, some remedies that are common sense that need to happen. So just start networking more, you know, crossing cultural paths, crossing, you know, whatever you might think is a discomfort, but we're all in this together. And so if you've never gone to a Latin club because you're not interested in Latin, or a science club or English club, I think some of the club members need to cross over and look and go to clubs outside of where they might be at already.
Thank you so much. So much to think about and so many things to do. I would like to thank our attendees. Now we should hear roaring applause, of course, in our virtual space. This doesn't happen. It's not the same. I hope we'll have you next time in person on our campus. I just want to remind our attendees that this talk was recorded. We are going to post it on our website. Also on our website, you can see a whole set of events that are upcoming. The Courage to Change program for Spring 2021 cultural session. Please take a look and attend as many of those events as you can. You will find instructions on how to sign up there. So thank you so much, Sherry. Thank you to all of our panelists today. And
thank you.